All righty, welcome in. I have a guest today. One of the best coaches that I've talked to in terms of like just really taking really good care of his clients. So I'm excited to have him on. Sam Forget, and I had to like double check it, and just because I have it in my head that it's going to go one way or the other. Sam Forget, nutrition coach, weight loss coach, and he is here to um, talk through a lot of different stuff today. So I'm excited to have Sam on.
Thank you, man, both for nailing the last name, which, as you know, is a bit of an anomaly for a lot of people, but also for the kind words. I do appreciate it.
For sure. It's like the fancy. It's like Target, right? Like you call Target Target and you sound fancier.
Tarjay.
Like you're the fancier version of what it could be.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I want to start here cuz this is maybe a little bit of an interesting place. A little bit of an interesting place to start, which is for a lot of people listening, this is a foreign concept to them, but I know that this is something that you just did recently was you prepped for your first ever bodybuilding competition. So you did a whole prep for it and the lead up to it, trying to build as much muscle as you can, and then the final prep for it to cut down to basically nothing, right? Like it was wild to see. Like I almost didn't recognize you in the stage photos with how lean you got, and you looked fantastic. But uh, I know that you wrote a whole big blog on this, but I'm curious, kind of as you reflect now, even a couple months removed from that, what were some of the takes that you had from going through that process that are applicable to the average person who's not necessarily looking to do bodybuilding things, but is looking to make some body composition changes, having done the most extreme version of it?
Yeah, sure. And for a little bit of context, just to really paint a picture here, I started my prep at a little over 200 pounds, pounds, which is generally what I walk around at. And I was 176, maybe 177 pounds on stage. And I haven't been that light since middle school. So I lost, over
Oh
20
my.
pounds of fat. Yeah. So it was quite gnarly. But something I think that people would find interesting is that, you look at, whether it's my before and after and my glammed up stage photos, or you hear numbers like this,
Mm-hmm.
and you would assume that I do or had to do this very extreme, unique stuff. And in many ways, yes, the process is extreme, but really only toward the tail end of the diet. So what I mean by that is if you look at what I actually did to see the biggest changes in my body composition, it's basically exactly what I would tell any client to do. I just pulled the levers a little bit harder and then I did it a little
Mm-hmm.
bit longer. So in terms of the level of overall consistency required, in terms of the duration required. And I certainly crept into the territory that is, one, not healthy, because there's no two ways about it. Getting that lean is not a healthy thing to do. And into the territory that simply would not be worth it for 95% of people. But in terms of my daily action steps, the levers were basically identical to what we would have our clients do. So, with most of the people we work with, maybe we might encourage them to train 2 to 4 days per week, focus on progressive overload, get your steps in, mostly single ingredient foods, try to hit, if you have calorie and macronutrient targets, 24, 25 days per month. I just did all that stuff, but a little bit more. So train closer to 5 to 6 days per week. Steps were closer to 12,000 plus per day. Consistency has to be basically 100% toward the tail end of things. But yeah, I think people might be surprised by that. You look at the before and afters and people on stage and you assume maybe it's fancy supplements or protocols or all these things. It is the same levers that I would ask you to pull, even if you don't want to step on stage. I just pull each of them a bit harder, and then the total duration is a little bit longer into that territory that's not worth it for most people.
That's a really interesting way of kind of putting it, which is the truth that we know, which is there's only four things that really matter, in this, like in body composition, and it's a matter of degrees. that is the difference between somebody who's the consistency degree and the longevity degree. So the difference between me and you, and the distant, like right now, like actually me and you, and the difference between me and somebody who's untrained and not doing anything is all a matter of degrees. Because I think oftentimes we get people who come in the door who are like, I eat pretty well. Right? Like that's a common phrase, is like, I eat pretty well. Like my meals are pretty solid, and I work out pretty often. And I don't know why I'm not seeing the progress that I'm hoping to see. And there's sort of a tipping point between what is often enough to, or what is consistent enough, what is the long time, the longevity enough in order to see the changes that we're hoping to make. And there's sort of that tipping point there between, and obviously you're on the far end of that spectrum, and somebody who is sedentary is on the other end of that spectrum. But I think a lot of people who are most frustrated live somewhere in the middle, and they're like just a bit shy of what is required.
Perfectly said. The analogy that I often use here is, if I were to try to boil some water right now and I turn the burner up a third of the way, maybe 40% of the way, and just left it there, no matter how long I let that water sit, it's never going to cross the threshold of actually boiling. And that's how a lot of people approach fat loss stuff specifically, where they're doing enough, they're turning that burner up enough to feel like they're doing something, they're accumulating time with that burner on, but they never actually reach the threshold where, ooh, okay, the water's boiling now. And obviously, in the case of fat loss, that's the tangible result that then motivates somebody. Another analogy that kind of goes hand in hand with this, and actually just put a post out about this yesterday, is that most people settle for close enough far too
Mm-hmm.
often. So you assign a
Mm-hmm.
calorie range of 16 to 17. They hit 1843. They're like, oh, it's not too far over. And that's true in isolation. So fine. Nothing to stress. Step goal, 8,000. 6,000 is not too far off from that. Same thing for protein, fiber, workout frequency, etc. And each one of those things is like a plane being just slightly off course. So fine for a little while. But if you let
Mm-hmm.
time continue to pass, actually the analogy that I often use here, which kind of indirectly takes a jab at Canadians, is if I'm in Boston and I'm trying to get to LA and I don't let the plane, or I don't course correct, I'm going to end up in Calgary. Nobody wants to end up in Calgary. That's nobody's objective. I mean, again, both analogies are quite similar. Whether it's the burner that's a little bit up or the plane that's slightly off, in either case, we're accumulating time. We feel like we're doing something, but then you end up with lukewarm water, or you end up in Calgary, and nobody's after that stuff.
Which is really funny because I'm going to Edmonton in like 2 weeks, and so it's
Yep.
it's like Calgary West,
Yes.
basically.
Yes.
Which everybody's like, "Oh, that's so exciting!" I'm like, "I'm going to a hotel room. It just happens to be in Edmonton." Is really what's happening. It's a conference room, and it's just on the other side of the country. But yeah, the feel like that's the most frustrating thing. Is like, I feel like I should be seeing more progress than I am. And that's the problem with, like, thinking about the I really really like the water boiling analogy, because you're expending energy that entire time. And like you're paying for the electricity or the gas or whatever it is that is that entire time, and you're not getting anywhere. And so it's like running your air conditioner with the door open. It's
Yeah.
like we're letting the bot air out, like the southern mom, like, you're letting all the bot air out. Like, that's the vibe, is like, we're putting in effort, but it's not enough or appropriately placed in order to see it. And that's where people get so frustrated with this process and give up, is because it's like, I feel like I'm doing all the right things or enough to see the progress that I hope to. I actually had a client say this the other day. She said, I feel like I'm doing enough to not weigh what I weigh. And I was like, that's a valid feeling. Like, you are allowed to feel that way. But the math isn't mathing for you. So even though you feel this way, the laws of thermodynamics don't stop with you. Like, something isn't quite in balance and it's not enough. And so I get that you feel like it should be enough, but it's not quite there. And we need to figure out what lever we need to pull a little bit harder in order to get us up over that threshold to start seeing the tangible results of our work, because otherwise it's just spinning our wheels and it's like, all right, why are we even bothering?
Yeah, losing the bot air. I've never heard that before. I like that analogy. But this is where I don't want to be just gloom and doom. Hey, you're not being consistent enough. This is where I also want to add that most people are closer to, having that water boil than they might realize. So yes, I'm sitting here saying the burner's not up high enough. You're not doing enough. Like you said, the math ain't math. And if you're not seeing the results hereafter, that burner isn't up high enough. But the good news is, just like in this water boiling analogy, sometimes you just have to turn it up a little bit more. 8 minutes goes by. I don't know. Not that you're going to lose fat in 8 minutes, but we're really doubling down on this analogy here.
We're just going with it.
8 minutes go by, maybe 8 weeks in the fat loss world. And then all of a sudden you're seeing the results that you feel like you've earned. And, I tend to be a bit data driven. So, when I look at the consistency percentages of my clients, the people who are not seeing the results that they want are somewhere between, call it 50 to 75% consistent each week with their nutritional targets, workout step totals. And if you think about that, like academically, that's anywhere from an F to a C. Whereas the people who really get over the threshold and see the best possible results, 80 to 85% consistency. You don't really ever have to be 90, 95 plus percent unless you are doing what I did a few months ago. Everybody else, 80 to 85%, that's generally going to be fine on a weekly basis. So yes, if you're not seeing the results hereafter, you're just simply not being consistent enough. But the good news is you probably are closer to seeing that. I'm going to leave this analogy in the dust after this, but you're probably closer to seeing that water boil than you think. It's just turning it up a little bit more.
Well, I think one step further from that, because this is the other side of the equation that you talked about, is the longevity piece of it and the patience piece of it. Because I'm gonna go back to the analogy because I really like it. I can turn the burner on high, and it makes no sense to be disappointed that it's not boiling after 30 seconds. You know what I mean? Like, that's an unrealistic expectation. And even though I'm doing what I need to be doing, at some point I need to give it enough time to see the results, because a lot of it's like, hey, this is going to happen, not because we have the expectation oftentimes because of marketing and the way that we grew up. And particularly, I think for you and I, a lot of the clients that we work with kind of grew up in the Weight Watchers, Jenny Craig, that sort of thing where it's like, I lost 25 pounds in a minute and a half with, Jenny Craig. And I looked at, this thing, and all of a sudden I was, snapped my fingers, and there's a little bit of that ingrained in us. And it's hard because even you and I, the marketing piece of it as coaches is you kind of have to tell people what they want to hear to some degree. Like, it doesn't sell to like market, feel your, like it does, but like lose 10 pounds in 12, in 8 weeks is everybody understands that. And so there's a goal and there's a timeline. And if we're not hitting that goal based on that timeline. So what was, just out of curiosity, what was your timeline for your, the 25 pounds that you lost? How much of it was in the final prep stuff? And then also, how do you, again, what's the carryover for you to clients and patients and some of that stuff? What do you talk through with that sort of thing?
So I'm going to answer that question in a second, but I think it's quite funny that the second I said I was going to leave the water boiling analogy in the dust, in the back of my mind, I'm like, the duration piece would be a good addition to this. But and then you're like, yeah. I'm like,
It's good that we're thinking on the same page. Like it's a really good analogy. I'm stealing it and I'm running with it.
Steal it. But to actually answer your question, and yet again, I think this will be surprisingly relatable to a lot of people, even if you don't want to step on stage with a spray tan. Is I was maybe 6 weeks out or so and didn't feel anywhere near as ready as I should have been. And numerically, things felt very off to me. I was feeling very impatient. I was checking in with my coach, like, hey, should I be a bit further along? What's the deal here? And unsurprisingly, he hit me with a dose of our medicine, which is, hey, the results are never going to be linear and they're always going to take longer than you think. And I'm, what? What do you mean? And so I had to ride that out a little bit. And I would say I was actually close to, I mean, there's some water manipulation at the end, but close to 8 to 9 pounds at the tail end of things. But I would say I averaged maybe right around a pound per week. Now, I didn't diet for 24 straight weeks. There were some diet breaks and some mini maintenance phases in there. So, I mean, if you look at the overall journey, I mean, definitely north of 6 months. Again, not dieting the entire time, but dieting the entire time would have been unwise anyway. And I think something for people to keep in mind is that, and I'm sure you talk to your clients about this all the time, the differences between weight loss and fat loss. And we all tend to use those phrases interchangeably, but it's really fat loss that we're after. And if you pick up the pace of weight loss too much, there's a high likelihood not only that you're going to rebound, but you're also going to lose some muscle along the way. And if I were to say, hey, we can get the scale to go down faster, but you're going to feel worse, you're going to lose muscle, you'll notice a negative visual difference relative to your goals, and you'll likely rebound. Or the scale change can be a little bit slower, it can be a little bit more patient, and we can avoid those things. Most people say they would want the second thing, but then they operate like they want the first thing. And I realize that's a little bit of a side tangent. But yeah, I would say north of 6 months of on and purposefully on and off dieting to see that transformation, which to your point, the 6 month diet doesn't sell quite as well. Never mind more than 6 months compared to the 6 week, body fat makeover or something like that. So I think, most people should double or triple their expected timeline, which may sound daunting or discouraging at first. But again, if the alternative is just pursuing aggressive weight loss at all costs and ending up in the same spot 6 months from now, ironically enough, that ends up being the slower thing in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, it's a little bit of, I hate to use a really cliche analogy, but like the tortoise or the hare, right? But like you can sprint and then stop and then sprint again and then stop versus just like, all right, I'm just going to pace this out. And yeah, like that's a reasonable timeline that we would tell all of our clients is like, hey, if you had 25 pounds to lose, you're probably looking at 6 months, like as a floor for doing this in a way that like you keep it off. And that doesn't mean that you couldn't do it a little bit faster, but it also might mean that it's a little bit slower. Just like with everything, there's ranges. If you've never actually done, like if it depends on where you're starting, right? If the burner's on, to go back to our analogy at 40%, then yeah, you might be closer to 6 months because it's just a little tweak with your consistency and then stay patient. But if it's not on, you don't have a pot, you don't even know where your pot is in the house, like it might take a little bit of work to get you to the point where we're starting to turn this thing on and go. And man, this is what I do on this podcast, by the way, is analogies to their first extent. So anybody who's listening, who's listened to an episode before is like, yeah, we know that we're going to take this really far, but, love it. But there was an interesting thing that you said in there, which was, you said a lot of interesting things, but one of the ones is the idea of a diet break. And you're, I think a bigger proponent of this than almost, I don't know about anybody I know, but one of the bigger proponents of this that I know of, like, diets are short term and you are on and then you're not, and it's on purpose. So what was your thought process on that in going through it? And then how did that influence now how you maybe explain it to clients or talk it through with clients a little bit different in terms of now you've experienced it really in an explicit sort of way that maybe you hadn't done to that extent before?
Yeah, for sure. So, one thing that I always like to clarify with clients is that in the industry, we use the term diet break, which for anybody who's unfamiliar, that just means going up to your maintenance calories for a little while, whether it's for just the psychological breather or if it's a bit longer, which we would generally call a maintenance phase. You get some more physiological benefits to that. But I think when you say diet break specifically, to most people, that sounds a little bit like a free for all. Ooh, I get to take a break from dieting and just kind of do whatever. But again, the thing that I always emphasize, it's really a deficit break in practice. So, we're going from, I'm going to make this up. I forget exactly what my calories and macros were. Say it was, toward the end of prep, 2,000 calories, maybe 2,200, which is about 1,000 calories under maintenance for me. The diet break is not me just eating whatever I want and doing whatever, and then I'll get back on track in 2 weeks. It was just adding bigger portions of the foods that I was already eating to get back up to maintenance. I think there's tremendous benefit to just seeing what that looks like on your plate, by the way, proactively, which is why I like to have clients break mid diet, not just for the psychological upside, but for the actual practice of what does maintenance look like on my plate. So yeah, I think that's a very important distinction when you are taking a diet break. Say we're not breaking from your usual food quality or your meal frequency or plate structure or anything like that. You're basically just having, for the most part, you can get away with a little bit more flexibility, but you're basically just having bigger portions of your existing meals, which I think is another important distinction. If you were to ask us the difference between a weight loss diet, a maintenance diet, and say a bulking muscle gain diet, it's basically the same, with the different primary difference being portions. We pull those levers up and down a little bit. And then again, when you are at maintenance and when you are in a surplus, go ahead, enjoy a little bit more flexibility. But if you get too flexible, you end up eating up your calorie budget too quickly. And then it feels like you're in a deficit again because things feel tighter than they need to be. But yeah, I think that's always a really good place to start expectation wise. This is a deficit break. This is not a get away from everything that has brought you the success thus far kind of break. We're not doing that.
Well, and this is, I think, an important clarity thing is like you get a break when you've done work. Like this is an important distinction for a lot of people, is like it doesn't make sense to take a break unless you've actually figured something out. So like if you're like, oh, I'm gonna do a cheat meal, or this is a freebie thing, or you know what I mean, like all of these things, like life happens and there's going to be natural circumstances that are harder to navigate. But if you're like you're kind of, hey, I've been solid for a week, I need a break. It's like, no, there's probably something to the, like, are you working too hard? Like, are you too extreme with your deficit that's like, hey, this isn't reasonable for you to stick with for longer than a week? Because that could be like, all right, you're eating, you're a 5'6" woman who's eating 1,200 calories. It's like, that might be a little bit too extreme of a deficit for you to maintain for long enough to see the progress that you need to. So if you have to go like a week on, a week off, that might be a little bit too extreme. But you have to get to a place where you've done some work and you've earned the break, like that sort of a thing, versus like, okay, we just like, when I used to teach, you get kids and it would be like 20 minutes in their class and they're like, can we take a break? Because we used to do 90-minute blocks. Can we take a break? And I'm like, you've done one problem. Like you have not you have not earned your break yet. It would be like having a vacation the third week that you start a new job. It's like, okay, I started my new job and I like, you don't take a vacation for the first 6 months. Like that's just kind of expected. Like you gotta earn the break. So what's sort of if you were thinking about that timeline, that kind of waves, what's sort of a minimum amount of time, and it's not a prescription, but like a minimum amount of time to like, hey, I've been in a deficit and I've seen some progress, before you're like, all right, we want to see at least that before we go on a break. And then kind of what's your top end of what a break would look like?
Oh, that's a great question, because what is unique about prepping for a physique show is that it doesn't matter how you feel mentally. Like I don't care if you feel
Yeah.
deprived, like I don't care if you feel sad, you have to say no to foods on Christmas. Like it doesn't matter. You signed up for this thing, you're stepping on stage with your spray tan and you're trying to get your out. It doesn't matter how you feel. So I think that is unique in that the duration of dieting and then the duration of the break are going to be at least a little bit skewed. But I would say, generally speaking, I mean, with few exceptions, I might occasionally have a client do what's called a mini cut, so something closer to 4 to 6 weeks. But I would say in most cases, on paper, I'm having somebody pursue a deficit for a minimum of 8 weeks, and then depending on a variety of factors, how much weight they're looking to lose, lifestyle demands, consistency, etc. Often up to 10 to 12 weeks, rarely too much more. Again, people looking to lose a large percentage of their body weight can generally get away with a little bit more, followed by a break. I mean, at least a week, if not 2 or 3 weeks. But again, beyond that, that's where I would personally start to categorize it more as a maintenance phase. Okay, you've been dieting on and off for 6 months. Let's sit tight for 2 months, not just for the psychological benefits, not just for the physiological benefits, but so you can literally practice what I think for most people is the hardest part of the dieting process, which is maintaining the results after the diet is over. And most people
Yeah.
make the mistake of never practicing that. They just get to the end of a diet or a program and they're like, all right, cool. I got my before and after. I saw a number I haven't seen on the scale in a while. I did it. I'm like, you did a good chunk of it and you should be very proud. But this, in many ways, I mean, it's a cliche thing to say, this is where the work begins. But that is
Mhm.
really it for a lot of people. Most people who apply for coaching with us have done, I mean, double-digit diets for sure, if not dozens
Mhm.
of semi-successful short-term stints of weight loss. It's the after that is so important for you to be on top of. And to go back to the actual question, that's one of the reasons why I like scattering in diet breaks to stay ahead of a lot of the burnout and again some of the physical stuff, but also to get that practice before you get to the tail end of a diet when you're super fried and you just want to take your foot off the gas altogether. Now you've learned, again, what does maintenance look like on my plate, how flexible can I actually get away with being, and all that stuff that's so important for the long term.
100%. The idea, like, what I try to tell clients is like, hey, I want this to be the last before picture you ever take. When you start working with me, like I want this to be it. But in order for that to be the case, like that means that what we have to do needs to look different than what you've done in the past, which is both in the process of losing the weight, because a lot of people, like you said, can lose weight. Like if I did a post yesterday that was basically like if I made you, like if I told you I'd give you $1 million to lose 20 pounds, you'd probably do it. Like you would figure out a way to do it. You could lose 20 pounds. The challenge for most people is not the losing, it's the maintaining and knowing how to like do life. Like it feels a little bit binary of like I'm on a diet or I'm not on a diet, which is why I like your idea of like shifting the idea of like, hey, you're right. Like there is a deficit and then there's not a deficit, but we got to figure out like what does not a deficit look like that's not eating like an asshole. Like there's a middle ground between like over the top that got you to where you are and it's a lot closer to that. So like it's figuring out how to eat what looks like on my plate. So that's a skills conversation. Oftentimes that's where we get away from the math side of it. Like there is a number for maintenance and stuff like that, but it's oftentimes more to do with skills and like navigating like, hey, maybe I'm not tracking and weighing all of my food for forever more. So what does this look like on my plate? How do I, raise the lever on, enjoying myself a little bit more, going out to eat or some of my favorite foods and have a little bit more of that flexibility and not tip over the edge. So in the process of the deficit, what are some early skills that you're focusing on with clients that are like, hey, these are going to be long-term beneficial for you that will help you now, yes, but we're more playing a little bit of the long game, like Mr. Miyagi and the Karate Kid. You know, like I'm teaching you something, but I'm actually teaching you this other thing for
Yeah.
12 weeks down the line that you're not actually aware of yet.
Yeah, this is a really good question. So I'll briefly touch upon a psychological thing that I think is extremely important to set people up for success with the tactical side of things. And the psychological thing, here we are talking about it's going to take longer than you think, and you're going to have to sacrifice more than you currently are. And you can never go back to what you were doing before. And all of these things that I realize can sound a little bit like a prison sentence. Sam and Jeff are taking away our fun forever. Like I can never, go back to what I was doing. But this is where I think it is so important to focus on everything you stand to gain, everything what I call behind door number 2 when you choose to make a sacrifice. So yes, we're sitting here saying you can't always step through door number 1, which is the eat and drink whatever, whenever door. But when we encourage you not to step through that door as often, it's not for fun. It's not for the hell of it. It's not just to test your discipline or willpower. We're just saying, hey, go behind door number 2 a little bit more often. And there is so much good stuff waiting for you behind that door, not feeling like death when you wake up in the morning. In your case, being able to keep up with your kids pain-free, especially as they get older and more athletic. And you don't want to sit on the sideline, hey, you're doing great. You want to go participate, being able to make memories in retirement because you're physically able to do more things that may not be available to you otherwise, reducing the risk of chronic disease, blah, 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 blah. So many other things that are behind door number 2. So I realize that we are emphasizing the level of sacrifice and consistency and patience required, but it's not just to have a vein in your bicep or a flatter stomach. Those, for some people, cool, that's a nice additional benefit. It's because there's so much other stuff that makes your life meaningfully better. So I always put that on people's radar early so they don't just feel like this is some, discipline tester program. Like, yeah, there's a level of that, but it's because there's a lot waiting for you behind that door. And then on the more tactical side of things, I think something that's extremely underrated that is finally getting a little bit more attention in our industry is people's ability to cope with stress and anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
Really any mental hurdle, because most people, they have the grocery list, they have the meal plans, they have the perfect program on paper. They're throwing that out in the moment, not because they don't have the knowledge, but because they're turning to food and drink to numb or alleviate in some way. So again, on the more tactical side of things, something I like to do with clients early on is say, hey, I would never ask you to do this, but if I asked you to not eat out, not get takeout, not splurge, and not drink for the next 3 months, how would you unwind? How would you decompress? What would you do for fun on the weekends? And most people can't, I don't know, read a book. Like they have basically nothing. And I say that not to give anybody a hard time, but because that's such a great opportunity for us to get ahead of that phase that you and I were just talking about and say, okay, this macro stuff, the numerical stuff, it's all important, but it ceases to be as valuable as it could be if I keep disregarding all of it, using food and drink as a coping mechanism. So I think it is so important to proactively build out that coping/recreation toolbox. That way, long-term, you're not in a situation where it's, oh, I know what I need to do. I just need to get myself to do it. And I don't, because food and drinks are my outlet. So again, I think that's somewhat underrated. I do think it's getting a bit more attention recently, which is, a very good thing.
Yeah. Uh, Two things there. I want to spend a lot of time on that last bit. But before we do, the thing that you said, which is highly underrated, and it's one of the, I think, the most important things that I do as a coach, and I'm sure we both do early on, which is like, what's behind door number 2? Like, what's the point B that you're going to? And it's more than just like, so Sam's coming to us from Buenos Aires right now, right? When you talked about, like, when you were thinking about, like, I'm going to go to Buenos Aires, it wasn't like, I just want to go to the airport, right? You were like, I want to experience these things, right? Like when I say I want to go to Paris, it's not like, all right, I just want to go and say that I've been to Paris. I want to, whatever, eat cheese and drink wine in front of the Eiffel Tower on a park or something like that. Like I want to have this experience and I can taste it. I can like feel it. Like this is the real thing that I really want. And so when we think through those sorts of like, what what does point B look like? I think oftentimes, you kind of alluded to it, is like what starts us might not be what finishes us in terms of motivation. Like, I think a lot of people start with the idea of like, yeah, I just want a flatter stomach, or I want my veins to pop, or I want to be whatever, more confident, fit in my clothes. And all of those are really good and valuable goals. But I think what happens that you and I have discovered is oftentimes when we get a little bit further along, we or clients find that there is so much more behind door number two, but you need whatever catalyst it is to get you to open that door. Is like, hey, I'm going to go try it. But then the more you get into it, the more you discover. Like, I have a client who has been on the podcast, Ashley, who is, she's down like 35, 40 pounds or something like that. And she wanted to start running for her health, and very different from running when she was at her previous weight for fat loss, because it's very different to run at 180 pounds than it is to run at 140 pounds on your body. And she's like, I love this. Like, I feel athletic. I feel badass. Like, I enjoy it because I know, like, I feel healthy, and it's like a great thing versus like doing it to punish herself. And so the experience is totally different behind door number two. But oftentimes I think people can get like a little bit caught up on like, oh, I don't have the right motivation. But it's like, whatever motivation you got, like, let it be what enters that door number two. And then as you get in there, you're going to discover more of these things along the way.
Definitely. And actually, a related example would be on the strength training side of things. I know we've both worked with people, I mean, countless people, who the gym is just not something they look forward to, whether it's gym intimidation. I just, I leave here feeling not very good about myself. I feel insecure, all of these things. But like anything else in life, when you get practice, when you get reps and you get better at these things, they start to get more enjoyable. So whether it is your client who started to enjoy running more and more as she was getting leaner, and I'm sure performing better and better over time, whether it is on the strength training side of things, even if it's developing better eating skills, things like I'm becoming a better cook, or I'm learning how to structure a plate a little bit better. Those are all skills that make this stuff more enjoyable. So for sure, when people start, things tend to be I just want the scale to go down as quickly as possible. But what you'll find is all the other parts of this process tend to get a lot more enjoyable the better you get at them. And, you mentioned me being here in Argentina. A related example would be me trying to speak Spanish I'm still not good, but me 3 months ago, that was not an enjoyable experience for me. I always felt very embarrassed, very insecure. I'd basically break a sweat if I said hola. And then now, again, I'm still not very good, but it's becoming more and more enjoyable for me to interact with people and attempt a language and do things that are a bit out of my comfort zone, things that I'm developing skills with. So I realize that sounds fairly obvious, like, oh, you tend to enjoy things you're better at. But with health and fitness specifically, I think that people often lose sight of that. Like, hey, there's a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel here, that as you get better with this stuff, you're going to enjoy it more.
Well, it'll just become a thing that you do. Like, it won't even, like, I think a lot of it, why it's not enjoyable, and this is like linking to the stress side of things, I think why it's not enjoyable for so many people is the amount of mental bandwidth that we spend on it. Like, the same client, Ashley, she told me, like, it was a non-scale victory for her 6 months in, and she's like, I listened to a podcast on the way into work, and it wasn't about health and fitness, because it was like a hobby of hers. She was just consuming this for a decade. What are all these things? It was all the people that she followed on social media. It was just like thinking about what's the right diet, what's the right thing for me to do, and is this what's right for my plate? When you're cooking the meal, versus like you and I, because we've been doing this long enough, we could go wherever and be like, I can make this work. And it doesn't really take a lot of mental energy to do what it is that I'm trying to do. But that comes with practice. It's like, to use the weird analogy of being a parent, is like the very first time you change your kid's diaper, it's like I'm going to break this kid. Like they have the alien tube coming out of them. That's their umbilical cord. And it literally looks like they're from Alien. You're like, and they have the self-destruct button on the top of their head. And you're like, I don't know what to do. And now like I can diaper my kids with one hand while they're trying to run away from me and like wrestling an alligator, and I can still do it now. But that comes from practice to the point where it's like I just do this. Like I've been doing diapers now for 4 years. Like I can do this without thinking about it. But that very first time I did a diaper, and for a while it was like, this is terrifying and not at all easy. And you spend so much time worrying about like what could go wrong, am I doing the right thing, and all of that sort of thing.
One, that is not an analogy I can yet relate to. So I have a little bit. So that's yeah. Well,
I think you could imagine it at least. Yeah.
For sure. Where was I going with that before I started thinking about eventually having to change diapers? Give me a second. On like the skill development side of things, and getting better with things. Something else that may sound a little discouraging, a little pessimistic at first, but I promise there's like a happy ending here, is that you're supposed to be bad at all of this stuff that you've always struggled with, that you're new to. And some of the best my podcast isn't active right now, but some of the best podcast, I don't even know if I could call it advice, but indirectly it was, that I ever got, was your first 50 episodes are not going to be very good. And even after that,
Yep.
they'll get like less sucky, but when you eventually get to episode 400, you'll listen back and be like, oh my God, who let me have a mic? This is terrible. Like, oh my, but that's supposed to happen. And I say that because with a lot of clients, whether it's a new exercise, whether it's a new dieting protocol, just skills that they are looking to develop, I think people put so much pressure on themselves to figure things out so quickly, where again, your first 50 episodes are supposed to suck. Mm. It's the same thing for a lot of these skills that are new to you or things that you've always struggled with. But like I said, there is a happy ending here. There's a light at the end of the tunnel that, like, if you just put your head down and keep plowing through, you'll come out on the other side. It'll eventually get more enjoyable. Now, I don't know if diaper changing would ever be enjoyable, at least to me. Maybe you can say otherwise.
It's not. No, it's never enjoyable. No, that's not. But it is. It does become automatic. It becomes. Sure. But you look back. Yeah. It is funny to look back on it. But to use that example of like podcasting and whatever, is the problem that I think a lot of people have is they'll do a podcast for 2 episodes, and then because they're not Joe Rogan, they'll give up. Or they'll be like, this format isn't working. Let me try a different format, and just keep hopping around. So you never get good at what it is that you're trying to do. So, and you get frustrated because you're not good at it. Like I took, it was at least a 6-month break in my podcast because I was like, I don't know what I'm trying to do here. And so when I came back, I was like, I'm going to double down on like, this is the ways that I'm going to do this. I'm going to have Amy on, who's a former client of mine. And when I do solo episodes, I'm just going to talk to Amy about whatever it is that I want to talk about. That's in my head. It's like going to have one topic, and I'm going to have other coaches on. And I talked to you about it before I hopped on. I was like, this is what my vision for how I do this. Do I do it great? No, but at least I have a clear thing that I'm shooting for, and I'm not going to deviate from that. And since coming back, it's been 40 episodes, and I've done it every week. And this is, these more recent episodes are certainly better than the ones I'm at. This is episode, I think, 66 or something like that I've recorded. And, it's still not great, but it's a lot better than my first interview episode that I did, which was like episode 2. And we get better at things. We just get better. But like, if you don't suck at the beginning, it's usually you're not doing it right. Like you should be really bad for quite a while.
And so That is so relatable. I listened back to my first few episodes. I'm like, good God. Like, but, but again,
But you
something
have to start. You have to start and be willing to suck. Like you have to be willing to just be bad for a bit. Otherwise, you will never get to a point of competence.
no, for sure. And again, something I don't want to get lost in the shuffle, so people just don't think we're all gloom and doom and boiling water
Yeah.
here. Is that a lot of the, call it C plus performances, whether we're talking a podcast, whether we're talking exercise execution, whether we're talking meal planning, whatever, can still move the needle in some capacity.
Yeah.
So it's not a scenario where until you and I are racking up millions of downloads in every podcast that, doing this stuff is entirely useless and helps nobody. There's no scenario where you walk into the gym, have an okay workout, you still feel a little unsure of yourself, not super confident, that doesn't still move the needle in some way. Same thing with meal planning, same thing with trying a new recipe. So again, yes, you'll pretty much suck at anything that's new. You're going to struggle with this stuff early on, but that doesn't mean you're not still moving the needle toward your goals. Eventually, those needle jumps will be a lot bigger, but whether it's 2% here, 2% there, that stuff is going to stack up in a major way.
Yeah, the thing that I say all the time to clients, and I've said it on this podcast, is don't take a zero. It's what I used to say to students is like, turn in a paper with your name on it and I'll give you a point. Like, don't take a zero. Even if you do math, if you do something that resembles math on the paper, I will give you some sort of credit for that versus not doing anything, because at least I know that if you did something that looks like math, you at least thought about it. And that's going to be serve you more than if you just resigned yourself to the fact that you're not going to get it and you didn't think about it. Because I can't take you from like you haven't thought about this to you get it to like you've thought about it and you have a clear block at some point, and then we can navigate that block. But until you've made an attempt, we can't figure out where you're stuck.
Jeff, I have to admit, as the proud recipient of the most likely to fall asleep in class in school, I do not think I would be an ideal student for you. Oh, and my brother won class flirt, so you can imagine how proud our mom was that her sons took home class flirt and most likely to fall asleep in class.
You know what though? Like you steer into who you are. Most likely to fall asleep in class is spectacular, because you were as attentive as anybody in when we were at the conference in Dallas. Like I was not. It's just maybe you weren't interested in the subject matter, because I have to step out every other lecture in those conferences, and you sat and you were as attentive as anybody for almost all of them, I think. And I was just like, I can't do this anymore. So maybe it's an interest thing.
I wasn't exactly jazzed up for British literature, but good with the fitness stuff.
There you go. Yeah, I don't think anybody's jazzed up for British literature. Let's just all be honest about that. So I want to circle back to the stress thing, and I think we can kind of use the rest of our time to kind of go with this, because I think that you're right, it is becoming more and more the conversation. But the things that I've talked about are, there's the mechanics, there's the hard skills that are required for the math equation of fat loss and body composition, right? It's calories, it's protein, it's strength training, it's steps, it's cardio, it's those are the things that are required for fat loss. We can't, if and or but about that. That's just what needs to happen. But the things that allow us to do that are oftentimes, for the consistency amount and for the length of time that we need to, and to be able to maintain them, are the sort of soft skills. Right? There's the hard skills and then there's the soft skills. And stress management, I call them the 4 S's. But stress management is one of them. Sleep, having a strategy or the ability to plan and navigate different situations, and then having support. Like those are the 4 S's of that. Like if you have those things, it makes it a lot easier to do the nuts and bolts. And so it's actually worth, from a skills perspective, spending a good amount of time on creating for yourself an environment in which you can be successful. And then it becomes a lot easier to do these things. But if you're like, I live in a household that only eats takeout food and I don't know how to cook, and I navigate my stress through alcohol, and I sleep 3 hours a night, and I game all the time, and everybody in my life just parties all the time, it's going to be, I don't care how good a coach I am, it's going to be really hard for you, or how disciplined you are. It's going to be really hard for you to stay in a deficit long enough to see the progress that you're hoping for and be consistent enough to see that within that. So when you think about the stress side of things, I think that oftentimes is the trickle down effect is going to be most like, hey, if you handle your stress, oftentimes your sleep improves, and that sort of a thing. So when you think about the stress side of things, how do you go about, for those clients who are like, I don't know what I would do on a weekend, to manage my stress? Where do you kind of help navigate through that? Because it is oftentimes we're trying to make a fish swim on land sort of situation for somebody who doesn't have good stress management skills, to be like, all right, now go eat well. It's like, well,
Yeah.
all right, we're flying against 40 years of operating a certain way.
Yeah, for sure. And I actually want to briefly circle back to the phrase that you use. Just make sure you don't take a zero, because I think a lot of times people's lives are inherently stressful. They have kids, they might have multiple jobs, whatever the case is, and they feel like, well, this is just my life. Is 10 out of 10 stress. Is not a whole lot I can do. And I'm not going to sit here and say I can get you down to a 2 or a 3 where you are in this Zen state all the time. But to me, the equivalent there of not taking the zero is, could we get your stress down to a 6 or 7 out of 10? Because that's still extremely high yield, again, for sleep quality, for frequency of splurges, the list of things goes on here. So I would say, above all else, just not resigning to the fact that this is just how my life is, a 10 out of 10 all the time. Because even if you can't reasonably get things down to, 2 out of 10 most days of the week, which I get, there's probably something you can do to at least get to that 5 to 6 to 7 range. Sometimes maybe even a little bit lower, and that's great. So it's the classic, something is better than nothing, because I don't really think people apply that to stress management. And on the more tactical side of things, when I have clients build out that toolbox that I mentioned, okay, the hypothetical of no splurges, no meals out, no takeout, no alcohol, what are we doing here? I often like to put it into 2 buckets. One would be, what are the things that are tangible to do on a daily basis, basically no matter your environment, even if you don't have a lot of time. So examples there would be like a written brain dump before bed, which you can do whether you're at a hotel. You can do that when you're at home. It could be going for a walk in the mornings, getting a little bit of sunlight. It could be unplugging a little bit earlier, so you're not just doom scrolling into the abyss and winding yourself up before bed. So I would want at least 10 things in that toolbox that fall into that category of, these are things I can do regardless of the environment, regardless of time. Breath work, for example, just this modified, inhale, deep belly breath, hold for 5. Pull in for 5, hold for 7, exhale for 8. Repeat that 3 times, for example. You can do that in your car on a lunch break, or maybe before you drive home at the end of the day. So I like stuff in that category. And then aside from that, I do like at least a few bigger things per week. So, this would be going on a hike. I really enjoy looking at art at a museum or connecting with a friend over coffee. Things you may not be able to swing every single day, but something to look forward to that's not just, splurges and alcohol, things that allow you to unwind and feel a little bit better. So yes, building out this toolbox, but again, from a tactical perspective, I want to make sure that people have plenty of things that are reasonable in basically any circumstance. And then we can put, say, 1 to 3 of those bigger items on the actual calendar on a daily basis, so you have stuff to look forward to.
Yeah. I think about them similarly. I think about them as preventative, and then, well, I'm blanking on the word, but like medicative almost. Like, that's not the right word, but like in the moment sort of situation. So it's like, for the person who starts their day at a 10, which is, I feel like almost every parent, it's like, all right, the first interaction of the day is a screaming child. It's like, okay, we got to start. If let's go back to the boiling pot analogy. Let's just bring it full circle, right? If we put water in the pot, this is now not the same analogy, but if we put water in the pot all the way to the brim and then we boil it, we're going to boil over. Like, we need some room in order for stress to happen. So if I start my day at a 10, anything happens, it's going to set me off. So I got to give myself some room. And so there's two things that I can do is if I can do some preventative work, which oftentimes is the night before, is those bigger things, right? Like, hey, I did a brain dump and I didn't doom scroll and I went to bed I had like an evening routine and I kind of like had a decent night's sleep. Maybe I wake up 20 minutes before my kids do and I have a cup of coffee without anybody screaming my name, whatever. I go for a walk, I get some sunlight, something like that. But I start the day at a 7, or lower, whatever it is. But if I can start the day at a 7 and then I have like occasional resets that bring me all the way down to like, man, I'm starting my days for a week and a half at like a 5 because I had that great connection with a friend or whatever. But then as the day goes, it's gonna creep up. You know what I mean? Like, life is stressful. It's gonna creep up. It's gonna creep up. So I need things to kind of like tamper it back down. So that could be the breath work. That could be, I'm gonna go for a walk in the middle of the day. It's those things to kind of deal with it in the moment. Like when my kid is screaming at me that they wanted the orange plate and I gave them the blue plate, and I'm trying to explain to them that the orange plate is dirty and they can't have the orange plate, and then they throw the plate at me. Like, that's a moment where like you need a skill, because it's very easy for that to take me over the edge, and or for me to just be like, all right, I got to swallow this so I don't blow up at my kid, but then I'm hosed on the other side of bedtime. So what are some of those things to kind of set me up for success, but then on the heels of it, that can help me deal with it in the moment when the stressful things come my way, because it's inevitable. Like, pretending that stress isn't going to happen is silly. Hey, if we do some of the preventative stuff, then we're starting with a little bit more room, and then we need some immediate skills to be able to deal with it in the moment.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love. Okay.
So
Yeah,
go
no,
right ahead.
I love the way that you categorize those. And now I'm like rethinking my own toolbox strategy and putting them into more subcategories because I do think that's a great point. It sounds nice on paper to have these tools that we can pull out to stay ahead of the stress side of things, which, the analogy we used of like, all right, let's start the day on offense, try to create a little space, get things down to that 7 out of 10, but then also being able to pull things out of that toolbox when, okay, today went a little bit awry. I started at a 5,
Mm-hmm.
I'm back up to an 8, and I feel like the cupboards are calling my name. What can I do to just take things down a little bit? So
Mm-hmm.
the example, we both just mentioned a written brain dump. So, at the end of the day, when you just want to hit the cupboards because you feel stressed, pulling out the actual piece of paper, put your phone down for 2 minutes, pull out an actual piece of paper, a little notepad. What am I feeling right now? How else might I address this need or this feeling or this concern without turning to food or drink? How might I feel if I don't and I just go with the food anyway? I think sometimes, actually, this will sound a little backwards coming from a nutrition guy. I don't think food as a coping mechanism is inherently bad. I think, once in a while, if you've had a long day and you want a glass
Yeah.
of wine and a piece of pizza, that's fine. It just can't be the only thing that's waiting for you in that toolbox. So that's where just pausing. The objective
Mm-hmm.
is not banning food and certain drinks altogether. It is just pausing for a second and, okay, what can I do in this moment to potentially get that stress down a little bit and make a better decision? So, yeah, in short, I love the way that you broke that down even further. What can I do to stay on offense here? And then what can I do when my back's against the wall? I think that's wonderful.
Yeah. Well, the defense, but that's an interesting way to think about it. So I think about these situations with food like it's a right turn on red. Like, you stop and you decide if you want to go, but like, you actually have to stop and look and make the decision that you're going to go or not. And if you decide to go, you go, right? Like, don't second guess yourself, because that's how you get into trouble. But like, make sure that it's actually what you want to do. And so in that moment, it's like, hey, is this trying to do something that it's not going to do? am I going to feel better or worse on the heels of this? Is there something else that I could do instead? And if we can do some of those things, like if we can make some of those moves, and just have another option that's not just food, then oftentimes then when we do decide to do the food, it doesn't carry the same like weight with it, or like feeling of, I don't know, like there's guilt associated with it and all those things, but it's like, no, I did it on purpose. It might not have been the best choice, but I did it on purpose, and at least I was aware of what I was doing, rather than like I did it, it almost mindlessly and out of like just automatic.
For sure.
And I need
And that
it.
obviously makes it infinitely more enjoyable when you don't also have that voice in your head that's, hey, you shouldn't be doing this. Hey, this is bad. Hey, this is fattening, whatever the case is. The thing that should theoretically be enjoyable, at least in moderation, you rid yourself of that. If you don't, again, we're just analogies galore today. I like the analogy you used of, fully stopping, pausing for a second. Is this really the direction I want to go? But then if it is, you commit to that.
Yeah. And not because I think that to end on the lighter note, right, is that there isn't, food is not inherently good or bad. It's not like using food as a coping mechanism is not inherently good or bad. Stress is not inherently good or bad. A lot of it is how we use it and how we handle it and our perception of it, versus, because like a workout is a stressor, right? Like it's not that we can't ever be stressed. Like we have to be stressed at some point, and it's good for us. It forces us to adapt and get better and move. But if we leave ourselves in a situation where we treat all stress as bad and eating, indulgent foods as bad, right? Then the emotions that come with it, that's what really starts the cycle of like crap, where we get stuck is like, oh, I was stressed, which was bad, and then I ate, Cheetos, which were bad, and so now I'm bad. I'm stressed about what I ate as a response to the stress, so then I eat more, and that's where we get into trouble. Like you stop it if it's like, hey, the stress is the situation, right? It's agnostic. It is a stressor, but it's how I respond to it could be good or bad based on how I handle it. And then the food is not good or bad. It's just food. And then was it intentional or unintentional? And then now the next situation is in a vacuum and not linked to the
Beautifully
previous
said. And
situation.
I think that's a wonderful mic drop moment that I will not mess with.
Well, dude, I know that we ran a little long. We had a little tech issue there, but appreciate you taking the time to come on. Any kind of last minute thoughts to share, and or where can people find you to get to know a little bit more about you if they want to
Yeah,
connect with
so
you?
my website, which is just samforget.com. My last name is spelled like forget, pronounced Forget. That's the home base for, articles, guides, podcasts, all that stuff. And I think it's very important at the end of a podcast like this, where we go over a lot of stuff, to kind of come away with an action step of like, okay, this stuff sounds nice. Maybe somebody's listening to this on a, commute to work, on the treadmill at the gym, the now what factor. And I think if people were to take anything from this podcast, it would be what we wrapped up with: sitting down with a pen and paper. What are some things I can do on a daily basis, both proactively, reactively? And then what are some things that I can do on a weekly basis, maybe bigger needle movers to actually put in the calendar? I think that alone will take everything else that we talked about prior with, the diet breaks and the calorie adjustments and, all that stuff, and make, workout frequency, execution. That will make all of that infinitely easier. So I would say if people just do one thing here, it's to start with that extra 15 minutes with a piece of paper, no phone, just a piece of paper, just get everything out of your head. What do my best days have in common? What makes me feel good? And then go from there.
I love it, and I'd be willing to bet if you haven't done this,
Oh,
it's
for
going to be
sure.
way harder than you think that it is. And so it'll be another one of those moments where you're going to feel bad at it. at the beginning, but like there isn't a good way to do it or a right way to do it. Even just sitting without your phone for 15 minutes and like thinking is a hard skill for a lot of people. So it's worth taking the time to do it. But Sam, really appreciate you coming on, bud. Hope you have a blast down there, and looking forward to the next time our paths cross. Whenever you're backstage.
I appreciate it, man. Always
We'll
a
talk
pleasure.
to you soon.